Hello, and welcome to my Humankind Classical Era tier list for the recent closed beta. I'm going to be discussing my tier list for the game's cultures in this 5-part series. You can see the Ancient Era tier list on the playlist on my channel, and future eras through the Industrial are going to be added over the coming weeks. This video is long, but if you're interested in a shorter 15-minute summary, check out the last timestamp in the description. For most of this video, we will be talking about each culture and all the unique features they get, how the cultures synergize with their affinity, how they combine with other cultures both in earlier and later eras, how they scale later into the game, some of the strategies they might use, and how they stack up with other cultures of the same era. Before we get into too much detail, let's talk about what defines each tier. And we talked a little bit about this in the Ancient Era video, so if you're interested in a more in-depth discussion about why I chose these tiers, you can check it out in that video. However, we will just talk about the overall definitions that I'm using for each tier. So for an S tier, this is going to be a culture that is excellent in every single situation they could encounter and considerably exceeds other cultures in at least one area. Alternatively, this can be a culture that has more situational bonuses, but when those conditions are met, that culture has the potential to win you the game due to that culture alone. An A-tier culture is going to be one that's always a good choice, but it may not be the best in every situation. However, you're still going to be able to perform very well with it regardless of the situation. Alternatively, this could also be a culture that meets the first part of the S-tier definition, where it's excellent in every situation and considerably exceeds other cultures. But instead of being in every situation, it's only in certain situations. That's going to be an A-tier culture. B-tier is going to be a relatively consistent culture that will be a decent choice in most situations, and it may even be very good in some scenarios. It won't always be the best, but they're usually pretty reliable, and you can still have a good game with a B-tier culture. C is going to be a culture that can do decently given specific circumstances that may be rare or difficult for the player to create for themselves. And what I mean by this is that the scenarios are ones that rely on, for instance, where you spawn on the map, whether you have access to a certain resource, how close your neighbors are, things that are beyond the control of the player. And outside of those circumstances, the culture struggles, and you should usually take another pick if it's available. A D-tier culture is going to be a culture that struggles in every scenario or is strictly inferior to another culture in every area. These are the trash tier cultures, right? The ones that you don't want to pick pretty much ever. There's really no reason to pick them. So the considerations for my tier rankings, and I had some other considerations as well, but these are going to be the primary considerations for how well does a culture perform. First, and perhaps most importantly, is how well can the culture generate its primary era stars. This is important. However, this degrades in level of importance the longer the game goes on. And the reason for this is because you are able to combine cultures throughout the eras. So even if you take a merchant civilization, say the Venetians in the pre-modern, they don't have any way to generate gold despite being a merchant culture. However, perhaps you took the Aksumites and the Nubians in previous eras. That means you still have the ability to generate your primary era stars, even without the current culture providing you benefits to do so. 2, how well can the culture generate other era stars? This is going to be the culture's ability to help you generate everything that isn't your primary era star, because you do need everything else. 3, how impactful is the culture's emblematic quarter? And then 4 and 5 are the emblematic unit and the culture's legacy trait. Those are self-explanatory. 6, how well do the culture's bonuses scale into later eras or combine with other cultures? 7, how strong is the culture's relative to other cultures in the same era? So, while something that's amazing in the ancient era, if you got the same bonuses in the modern, the pre-modern, it's probably not as good, right? And one example of this is the Mycenaeans compared to the Aztecs. The Mycenaeans in the ancient era get minus 25% production on their units, and they get a bonus to veterancy. The Aztecs in the medieval, they get a 25% bonus on production towards units. So they get the same they get the same bonus, but it's later in the game, and it's lacking a portion of something that you could get earlier. 8 is how well does the culture enable you to perform a strategy other cultures cannot. Being able to perform different strategies in order to open up your game, in order to encounter situations in a way you might not be able to with other cultures is really important in Humankind, because it gives you that adaptability to ensure that you're still generating your era stars even when things aren't going your way. 9, how strong is the culture's affinity? The affinity is a pretty important part. It declines a bit as you go through the eras, though other affinities get better as you go through the eras. So we're going to be considering this relative to the era that it exists in. And 10, finally, how well does the culture take advantage of its affinity? Some cultures do this better than others. They're able to make use of their specific affinity abilities better than others, and it can really help improve their game. Finally, before we get into the details, a few abbreviations I may use. CS is the combat strength. This is how powerful your units are. EQ is an emblematic quarter. EU is an emblematic district. FIMS is food, industry, influence, money, and science. So these are the main outputs of your civilization. And STAB is stability. That being said, let's jump right in. We're going to start in alphabetical order to make things simple, which means the first up is the Achaemenid Persians. They are an expansionist culture. So this means that they can freely trespass into other territory, and they can spend some gold to have a unit convert an enemy outpost or an enemy admin center to their own. Okay, great. That's lovely. They also get the legacy trait, +2 city cap. And this is a very flexible trait that's actually quite good. So there are a few ways to use this. If you're coming out of the ancient era where you really expanded, say you take the Mycenaeans or the Hittites and you took a bunch of cities and you're well over your city cap, you can pick the Achaemenid Persians in order to alleviate that pressure. Alternatively, if you plan to expand as the Achaemenids, which you probably should in order to gain your era stars, this gives you the ability to take over more cities reliably and with fewer penalties than you otherwise would. It also enables you to simply found your own cities if there's plenty of open area still left on the map. So and the city cap, when you have too many cities, you're going to have less influence than you would otherwise. I believe it's a 30 influence penalty when you're over the city cap, but that might increase with more cities. Influence at this point in the game is still relevant. You still need it to claim wonders. You'll still probably have some outposts you need to put down and others to attach. And you still want your Aesthete Era stars, because fame is how you win the game. Now, Aesthete Era stars in the classical are still relatively easy to generate, but if you're taking massive penalties to those, you're not going to be able to reach those stars as reliably. So the Achaemenids allow you to take over more cities and have more outputs without having the drawbacks of having more cities. So overall, the +2 city cap, very flexible and good trait. You want more cities, you want more outputs. So that brings us to the emblematic quarter, the Satrap Palace. This one is an interesting one, especially for an expansionist. So this thing provides some base money and influence, which is okay. Like I said, influence is still kind of relevant. A little bit of money is nice. But the real feature of this is the +3 money per trade route. So this really makes the Achaemenids quite capable at generating gold. And they can use this to feed the expansionist ability to take over outposts. And the extra influence, you can use that to help claim extra outposts or to claim wonders and that kind of stuff. However, this is really good. In the era that you get it, it is somewhat counter-synergetic in that you can't trade with people that you're at war with. So the Achaemenids are really pushed towards expansion because they are expansionists and you want your primary era stars. Theoretically, it is possible to do this without actually going to war by trespassing and stealing other people's stuff, but it is much faster and much easier to simply take over their cities. And you want their cities because you want to take their population, and you want to make use of your +2 city cap. That being said, this does scale later into the game, and it combines really well with the Ghanaians in the next era, who have additional benefits for each trade route, and it can make you a really, really good amount of money if you're maintaining stable trade relationships. Trade routes, you're probably going to have quite a few of them throughout the game, and you're going to have more of them as you get later. Near the end game, it might fall off a bit. You're likely to go to war with many, many people, and trade will be a little less reliable because you need a lot of territory in order to get your expansionist era stars later in the game. However, in the middle game, it's usually pretty easy to get several trade routes going, and you can make a fair bit of money from the Satrap Palace, even without combining it with something else. So finally, the emblematic unit, the Immortals. These are a pretty solid unit. They're a spear upgrade, which is a unit that doesn't have an upgrade in the classical, so that's a benefit. And this has a +3 combat strength bonus over regular swordsmen, so it makes it a fairly combat-capable unit. It unlocks at one of the very first techs in the classical era. It doesn't cost a lot of science, so you're getting this at the same time as you'd normally get swordsmen, and it only requires copper rather than iron, and you probably have at least 1 copper by this point in the game. Now, the Immortals do have a trait called Bastion, which is an interesting one. So Bastion makes Immortals stronger when they fight from the high ground or a fortified position. So what this means is that the Immortals, when they are on high ground relative to their opponent, they're getting the normal +4 bonus from high ground, and they get the additional +3. As you can imagine, this can make them very difficult to dislodge. If you're sitting in a city with fortification, you're also getting that +3 Bastion. So it can make it very difficult for an opponent to take your cities. Where it falls a little short for the Achaemenids is that as an expansionist civ, they want to be going out and attacking other people, not defending their own cities. So the Immortals, although they have Bastion and they're very good on defense, and on offense you can occasionally make use of high ground, when it comes to assaulting cities, there are many other emblematic units in the classical era that do better, that have more consistent combat strength bonuses, or are more reliably able to assault cities than the Immortals can. So the Immortals, while they're a good unit, they're a little bit strange in that they're defensive for a culture that wants to be on the offense. So, all that being said, I've placed the Achaemenids in the B tier. Like I've mentioned, they suffer from a couple design oddities, specifically the Immortals being defensive, and the Satrap Palace getting gold bonuses from trade when you're probably going to be at war. However, the +2 city cap is really good, regardless of what cultures you've picked. The Satrap Palace becomes more relevant the later into the game you go, at least throughout the middle of the game. And the emblematic unit, the Immortals, although they're not the best on attack, they're still capable. You can probably still take over some cities with it, but you have to watch out for some other emblematic units. As far as culture combinations go, the obvious one after the Achaemenids are the Ghanaians. It's really good to be able to build up that advantage on trade routes, and the Ghanaians are really, really good at generating money off trade routes, so it combines nicely with the satrap palace. There isn't a specific culture that I would recommend in the ancient era to take into the Achaemenids. Pretty much anything can work fairly well. Perhaps one of the good uses for the Achaemenids is if you had a more aggressive culture like the Hittites or the Mycenaeans, you go into the Achaemenids to help alleviate the city cap if you're 1 or 2 over. And then you also get some additional bonuses to your immortals when you start producing them. So the Hittites grant the +1 combat strength bonus, which can help you be a little more aggressive, or the Mycenaeans allow you to create more of them and gives them a little bit of veterancy, which also provides some extra combat strength. So the Achaemenids overall are a B tier. Next are the Aksumites. These are a merchant affinity, so this allows them to spend a little influence to plop down a resource extractor or to make some money off someone else's resource extractor. It also allows them to retrade any goods that they have traded from another player. So if you're importing sage from someone, you can turn around and sell it to someone else. So the plus 10% money generated from ongoing trade on city or outpost is a legacy trait that is hard to judge because there's a little bit of opacity in terms of how much money you actually are generating from this. My experience is that it's kind of hard to judge. What I can say is that you are going to be trading a lot as the Aksumites anyway. It's something you want to do. You want to get gold. You want to get access to more resources so you can resell them to someone else. This has, for a merchant culture, this has the double whammy because you're not only selling your own resources, but you're getting trade routes from reselling other people's resources. So it's a boost to something that you're going to do anyway. And that is always good. Being able to get a boost that you don't have to do anything special in order to take advantage of. But the extent to which this is going to affect your game is a little bit up in the air until we know more details about specific numbers. So the emblematic quarter, the Great Obelisk, is probably the best part about the Aksumites. And this is effectively a market quarter. You get a little bit of faith, which is nice to improve your faith spread, which is something the Aksumites really benefit from. You get a base of +1 money, you get +3 money per adjacent market quarter, you get your trader slot, but most importantly, you get +1 money per territory under the religion's influence. This is not just the territories within the city you built it. This is all territories that are under your religion's influence. So if you have 20 territories, for instance, under your religious sway, and you have 3 of these great obelisks in one city, you're going to be producing 60 gold per turn. This is actually pretty sizable for the classical era, and you can have quite a few of these across your cities. It also gives the bonus to faith, so it synergizes with itself. So a really strong use of this is if you take the Olmecs in the ancient era, you use the extra influence that you get in order to pick polytheism to get that extra bonus faith, and then roll into the Aksumites to get this money per territory under a religion's influence. And then from there, you can even go into something like the Teutons, which benefit from +1 money and +1 science for every religion under your religion's influence. And they get some bonuses on the Kaiserdom to increasing your faith output as well. So you can really build a decent strategy around faith using the Great Obelisk as one of the keystones of that. Now, the value of money has declined relative to the open dev because you're not able to buy stuff out as frequently because the cost of everything has increased. This decline, or I shouldn't say declines, this decreases the value of merchant cultures across the board. Where in the previous open devs, because of the ease of spreading your religion and how much more valuable money was, I would have rated the Aksumites an A tier culture. But it's changed a little bit since then. So let's talk about the emblematic unit, the Shodalai or Shadalai. This is basically a +2 combat strength swordsman. It unlocks at the same tech. You can produce it in a reasonable amount of time. There's 1 iron resource requirement. This really relies on this grappler effect. So it's supposed to have this larger zone of control, and it can't be ignored. The problem with this, at least in single player, is that the AI aren't very good. It has limited effectiveness against them because the AI are not good at unit cycling. And because of that, we don't know how effective this is going to be against people who are going to be much more effective at managing their units. But because the AI don't unit cycle, we don't know how this is going to interact with different effects related to zone of control. For instance, if you have one unit adjacent to another unit that has zone of control, and you have a unit behind your own unit, typically you're able to move through that unit without any zone of control penalties. What's uncertain about Grappler is how it interacts with that effect. We simply don't know at all, unless someone has been able to do some tests on this. It does have some applications in locking down cavalry, and depending on the specific implementation, it may really be good against things like the Huns and the Mongols or other things that can shoot and move because they'll be unable to get away from your army. So this is going to be something that I suspect is going to have many more applications in multiplayer as a strong defensive unit, but in single player is going to be a little more limited in scope. It's basically a +2 swordsman for single player. So where do I put the Aksumites? I put the Aksumites in the B tier, though I would put them as a lower B than the Achaemenids. The Achaemenids are a strong B. The Aksumites are able to pretty reliably generate quite a bit of gold. They play off a religion game, which the AI isn't very good at managing, so you can usually get a fairly powerful religion earlier into the game, and this allows you to generate more money. Of course, money isn't as good as it used to be, but being a merchant culture that can generate money, you're one of the few that can actually generate merchant stars reliably. Most of the other stars don't really require you to be that affinity in order to get them. But I've noticed that the merchant stars specifically are ones that really require a fair amount of investment, which means that if you're going for more stars, this raises the value of things that can generate those gold stars. And that's a reason why the Achaemenids are fairly good as well. I've mentioned before that the Aksumites, sorry, I didn't mention this. The Aksumites combine nicely with the Ghanaians as well, perhaps not as well as the Achaemenids. And then, like I did mention before, they're pretty good with the Teutons because of that combination with faith. So you take the Aksumites, perhaps a little more defensive in the classical era, and then you can explode out onto the scene with the Teutons and really establish religious dominance really early, which is going to provide you with a bunch of gold because of both the Teutons' ability as well as your great obelisk, as well as some science from the Teutons' legacy trait. This brings us to the Carthaginians. The Carthaginians are another merchant affinity culture. And we look at the legacy trait and we think, wow, this is insane. This is a clearance sale, right? I can get everything for 50% off. Okay, yes, it is really good. 50%, minus 50% on your buyout costs is insanely strong, and it really empowers buyout strategies. This is a bit of a natural combination with the Phoenicians, right, where you get that minus 20% buyout cost. Where you run into trouble with this legacy trait is that the Carthaginians don't have any innate ways to actually generate money that are unique to them specifically. So their emblematic quarter doesn't generate any money. And if you chose the Phoenicians into the Carthaginians, who are also kind of weak in generating money, you're going to have gone 2 eras without generating much in the way of your primary era stars. Because fame is the mechanic in which you win the game, this is pretty important. You're losing out on a lot of era score over 2 eras in order to try to empower your later game. So this scales really well. If you really want to make use of this, I might actually suggest picking the Nubians in the ancient era so that you can generate your primary era stars and be satisfied with the minus 50% buyout cost. If you have other ways to generate gold, that might also work, but market quarters, for instance, are not very good in the closed beta, or at least they weren't. We'll see how they look at full release. So let's talk about the emblematic quarter real quick, the Kothon. Kothon is funny, and one of the this is an aside, but one of the complaints I have about harbors in this game is because they're adjacency based, you're incentivized to stick them out as far into the water as you can. That's true with the Kothon as well, which is kind of ironic because the entire point of the Kothon was to kind of hide your ships away in a cove so that they couldn't be attacked very easily. Anyway, the Kothon gets +3 industry per adjacent coastal water or +2 per adjacent lake. What this means is that in an ideal placement with the number of tiles around each tile, you can have up to 15 industry from the Kothon if you're placing it in on a single land tile that's jutting out into surrounding coastal tiles. It's okay. It provides that industry, and it does give you that extra food, so you get some growth from this as well because it is a harbor, so it's exploiting those tiles around it for the food. And another thing that's worth mentioning is that if you have picked another culture that can also build a unique harbor, you can have several harbors in a single territory. Which has some benefits when it comes to adjacency bonuses, specifically with the Dutch, and it also provides you a fairly reasonable amount of growth coming from the sea. How impactful this is, it's not very high. So there's no scaling on this at all. This thing isn't super expensive. +15 industry is okay, and you do get the food bonus as well, which is good. So this is better than putting down like a well placed maker's quarter, and you do get the worker slot as well, so you're not really losing out on anything. But it provides no scaling throughout the game. You're not going to be benefiting from any of the infrastructures that improve maker's quarters from this, and you're going to be waiting a while in order to benefit from any adjacency bonuses. So it's a nice boost to your game, particularly early with the growth that it'll provide and a little bit of extra industry, but it's nothing that's going to be game-changing. It's just nice to have. The emblematic unit is the War Elephant, and the War Elephant is absolutely terrifying. You do not want to be up against War Elephants. It has 31 base combat strength, and because of trample, it has +4 combat strength when attacking weaker units, which is pretty much everything in the classical era. What's not clear about the description in trample is whether this applies based on the base combat strength of a unit or the modified combat strength of a unit. So say you have a 29 strength unit that is sitting on top of a hill. It's going to have the +4 combat strength from high ground, bringing it up to 33. Does a War Elephant get trample against that unit? I'm not sure. I wasn't able to test that. If it does, then the War Elephant is still extremely strong. If it doesn't, then it really limits the capabilities of the war elephant, particularly because the AI is getting +2 combat strength in Humankind difficulty. So this is not going to be as relevant against as many enemy units. But it does get charge as well. So assuming that it applies based on base combat strength, you're easily going to one-shot things like archers. Like, you can one-shot stuff with, 24 combat strength in the classical era with this. It's pretty strong. But there are a couple drawbacks. First, perhaps the smallest drawback is that it does require 2 copper. And based on your spawn, you may have a little bit of difficulty getting both of the copper you need. Perhaps the most important is that it comes at a dead-end tech that most civilizations are going to ignore unless they have a culture-specific unit that they get at that tech. And this is a second-tier tech, and the scaling on it. So the first tier in the classical era goes from 400 science, and the second tier is 1,000 science. So it's a pretty sizable jump. You have to make a pretty significant investment just to get this one technology, and you don't have any bonuses towards research with the Carthaginians. So if you want to get war elephants, you have to make an investment into this dead-end technology that doesn't go anywhere, and it's going to come at the expense of getting other things earlier, like getting more science from the top row of the tech tree, or getting hydrology, or other things that might benefit your culture. Finally, another drawback of the war elephant is that because it's a cavalry unit, it can't assault fortifications. And this is a significant drawback, right? If you have a really high combat strength unit that you're relying on to win you battles, you want to be able to use it to take over enemy cities. But with the war elephant, you can't really do that. The battering rams that you would use in order to destroy enemy fortifications are really easy to kill, and the war elephants can't do anything to stop your enemy from killing them. So in city sieges, they're kind of just stuck outside the walls. However, on defensive sieges, they are quite capable because they can attack out from your own walls. So they're good on the defense, they're good in field battles, but they're not going to do you a lot for sieges. So this puts the Carthaginians at yet another B tier. The reason I put them in B is predominantly because the scaling on the minus 50% buyout cost is extremely potent. The emblematic district is just okay. The war elephant is good on the defense and in field battles, but isn't going to be earning you expansionist stars and taking over other cities. Furthermore, the Carthaginians don't have any way to generate gold on their own that is unique to them, and they'll struggle to get the fame stars associated with their primary era star unless they pick something like the Nubians in the previous era. They can get a little bit through trade, but trade can be a little volatile, as I've mentioned earlier, and the classical era is an era in which there's going to be a lot of war, because in the classical era, the emblematic units become really powerful and the timing of them become really powerful because there are only 2 generic units in the tech tree that are unique to the classical era. And they're pretty much weaker than, everything else that's going to be running around in the field. Not only that, but you can get those emblematic units early. So there's going to be a lot of war and expansion in the classical. The Carthaginians are well suited to defending themselves with the war elephants, but it's going to be hard to take them on the offensive in order to take over someone else's city, in order to take their territories, and bring them into your own empire. Again, however, I can't emphasize enough the power of the buyout cost. It does rely on getting later merchant cultures that other people might pick up. And because you're going to be having slower star generation, you're less likely to be able to get the culture that you want later on in the game. So do be aware of that when you pick Carthage, is that you are betting that you're going to be able to get the merchant culture and really make use of that buyout cost reduction to generate you a lot of fame stars later in the game, and you're making up for the ones that you failed to generate in the classical and ancient era. Next on the list are the Celts, and they are an agrarian affinity. Now, the agrarian affinity isn't quite as good as it was in the ancient era. However, in the classical era, it is still quite powerful. Because you're going to probably have a larger border with your opponents, and you're going to have more cities, you're actually getting more population when you click the button to steal some pops. The Celts additionally have some ways to sustain those additional pops as well. So first, let's talk about the legacy trait, which is the +2 food on district producing food. This is an okay bonus. It has limited scaling because pops eventually become more important than your districts for generating your outputs. With 5 agriculture quarters, this is only supporting like 1 additional population. So it's okay, and across your empire, that can make a difference if you have a large empire, right? If you have 5 cities, each with 5 agriculture quarters, and you're supporting 5 additional pops, which is an okay amount of output. But there are much better legacy traits that are available both in the classical era and throughout the rest of the game. So let's talk about the Nemeton, the emblematic quarter for the Celts. It provides a little bit of faith, which is a nice bonus. It has a base of 1 food production, and it gives you +3 food per adjacent farmer's quarter. Those are all nice. And I should mention it also exploits food, which is also great. The kicker, the real thing that makes this really, really powerful, is that you get +1 food per population on your city. So, for every population on your city, you're going to get that +1 food. It makes it also more able to sustain the pops that you get from stealing with the agrarian affinity. And typically in a city, you're going to be able to get 3, maybe 4 of these per city that you own in the classical era. That's a reasonable amount of territories to have attached to your city. And this is so powerful that I want to show you some of the math behind population growth and why this is so good. So according to the Humankind wiki, there's a formula for the total food consumption of the entire population in a city. So where C is consumption, the total consumption is 0.1 times the population squared plus 8 times the population. So this is going to be a, I can't remember the name for it. It's going to scale parabolically, or it's going to, it's a nonlinear increase, right, in the food consumption per pop that you have. So what's easier to think about this is the scaling of the food that you need per pop rather than the total food consumption for your population. So if you want to get that, you can simply divide the equation by P, which is the population. So that gives you consumption per pop on the left, and it gives you the food consumption for those pops on the right. So this gives you this graph that we see here in the bottom right? This is y equals 0.1p plus 8. This is the cost this is the cost of maintaining your population in each city. So as you get more pops, the food cost per pop increases. So you can see that at 20 population, it's taking you 10 food per pop to maintain each population. So that's a total of 200 food. Now here's where the Nemeton kicks in. Because the food per population is scaling linearly, the +1 food on each population is effectively the same as a -1 food upkeep on each population. And we can represent that with the equation you can see here, which is y, which we're using to represent the food cost per population, is equal to 0.1 times your total population plus 8 minus f, where f is the food produced per pop. The red line that you see here is the normal cost per pop. The green line is the effective cost per pop with 1 nemeton. What this shows is that for each nemeton that you have in a city, you are decreasing the amount of food that you need per population quite substantially. The amount of food that you have to produce per pop at 30 population is the same as someone else having to produce that food for 20 pops. And this scales plus 10 for each nemeton that you have. So for instance, the purple line below that, which you can see the circle on the far right of the graph, you don't reach 10 food per population until you are at 50 pops. The value on this is insane. So at 25 pops with 3 nemetons, you're effectively consuming less food than another culture at 20 pops that doesn't have the nemetons. This is incredible. So what this allows you to do is that at 20 pops with 3 nemetons, you need 60 less food than another culture. And that's equivalent to about 6 farmers, depending on your infrastructure. At 50 pops, which is something that you can reach quite easily by the medieval age with the Celts, with 3 nemetons in your city, you need 150 less food than another culture, or somewhere between 10 and 15 farmers, depending on your infrastructure. With that number of farmers, over the course of the game, on multiple cities, you are literally talking about tens of thousands of production, science, and money over the course of the game. It is nuts how powerful this is. It is so insane. You have so many population that you won't know what to do with it. And this not only enables you to assign pops to different jobs, it allows you to use them to buy things out really consistently. And because you can use your agrarian affinity to continue to steal pops from other people, you're going to be able to grow at a really, really rapid pace and keep feeding the population buyouts. Okay, that's enough on the nemeton. Let's talk about the emblematic unit. The Celts' emblematic unit is the Gazzetti. And the Gazzetti are weaker than swordsmen. The base is -1 if you're on Humankind difficulty because of the AI buffs. You're talking about -3 versus the AI swordsman. They do have a benefit that they don't require any resources, which makes them an okay alternative if you don't have iron access. They don't have any combat strength penalty from being damaged, which is a nice feature, but it's not very impactful. So the problem with this is that because they start with lower combat strength, they end up taking more damage from attacks and do less damage to the things attacking them. So they have effectively less ability to get their opponents down to a weakened combat strength, and they take more damage, so they die earlier. Not only that, you should be cycling melee combatants anyway, and so should your opponent. So what this means is when your front line starts going to low health, you pull them out through your own units and bring forward a new frontline melee unit in order to start taking and doing damage. This is much more effective than relying on fervor. However, the Celts do have a very high population, right? And this allows them to get a lot of other FIMs as well, so they can produce a lot of Gazzetti. but they're not particularly strong. However, you can get a really good, solid horde of these things. They are, I believe, the weakest unit in the classical era of all the emblematic units. So you have to watch out for that. You can swarm the battlefield with so many that it's really difficult for another culture to deal with, but they're less competent in offensive sieges than most of the other units in this era. They're okay on defense when they get some buffs from the walls, but not as effective as other units. So overall, fairly below average unit. So where do I rank the Celts? Despite the weaknesses of the Gazzetti, Celts take my first S tier spots. And they're largely S tier off the back of their emblematic quarter, as well as their agrarian affinity, because more pops allow you to do everything. And the Celts get tons and tons of pops. And the Nemeton continues to help you throughout the entire game. It propels you to much higher levels of population that you can do literally anything with. You can produce any output, you can buy stuff out, you can produce military. This is enough to be an S tier, because having that much of a pop advantage is so good. It's so powerful. That, like I said before, literally tens of thousands of output over the entire game just by having a few Nemetons in all your classical era cities. The emblematic unit, the Gazzetti, not so good. You can use it in a pinch, doesn't require any resources. You'll probably be using it defensively. You're unlikely to do any serious expansions to Celts. You have to be opportunistic if you want to do so. And likewise, their trait, the +2 food on food producing districts, you get a little bit of a benefit out of it. It's nothing major. So the Celts, the Nemetons, that's what you want. That's what you're here for. And the Nemetons by themselves are enough to make the Celts ultra powerful. They do have some non-obvious synergies with some of the other cultures, specifically the Mycenaeans and the Hittites. So because both of those are competent at sort of early warfare, it's quite possible that you go into the classical era with a larger number of cities than you would otherwise, which allows you to put Nemetons in more cities, which allows you to snowball your population even harder. Additionally, the production and veterancy bonus from the Mycenaeans and the combat strength bonus from the Hittites help shore up your weak emblematic unit a bit, so they're a little bit more competitive with other emblematic units in the classical era. The more obvious synergy for the Celts from the ancients is going to be the Harappans. So you have a high population already, and the more population you get, the more population you have, the more food you're getting from the Nemetons, right? So you'll get a lot of value out of the Nemeton if you're going for the Harappans into the Celts, and you can sustain a really high population that way. But like I said, really, the Celts are all about the Nemetons. And something that's really great about them that I think that is undervalued is that population is the most versatile thing you have in the game, right? When I build a maker's quarter, all that gives me is provide production. I can't switch that on the fly. And as the game goes on, pops get more and more and more powerful because of the different infrastructures that you can build. So population plays in to any strategy that you want to do. And something that I've noticed a little bit about the community and ranking some of these things and in the discussions is that they're not thinking about the game as it's going to be. In the closed beta and in the open devs, you had a set scenario. So you knew the AI and their personalities, they were going to be the same every game. You knew the layout of the terrain. You knew where to settle your cities. You knew the strategy you could pursue because the AI was largely going to pick the same cultures every single game that you play. So this allowed people to develop some strategies based on the cultures that were typically available and they could reliably get in every time they played through the game. This isn't always going to be an option. So What'll happen when the full game is released and there's more randomization is that you're going to be able to less reliably get the picks that you want to pick. And this increases the value of cultures that can play into any other culture in the next era. Whereas specialist cultures that rely on picking another culture in the next era decrease in value because you cannot guarantee that you're going to get the cultures that you need. And the Celts allow you to pick any culture in the next era and have picked any culture in the ancient era and still be effective. So the Celts are an S tier culture. Going from the Celts to the Goths is a bit of a downgrade, but let's talk about them thoroughly. The Goths have a militarist affinity, and this is a little bit better for them than the Assyrians. Their legacy traits, quickly, a note on the Assyrians is that the Assyrians were an expansionist culture and they wanted to sort of run around and loot stuff, but that conflicts with the idea of expansionists. Goths can run around and loot stuff, and they can still get their primary era stars by killing a bunch of enemy units. So the legacy trait is +5 combat strength from ransacking an army, and the changes in the closed beta meant that a unit with higher combat strength or an army with higher combat strength ransacks more quickly. So this legacy trait means that the Goths can run up, they can go ransack an outpost, it's going to take them less time to do so, and if someone wants to kick you off the outpost, it's going to be harder to do that because you have an increased combat strength. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the emblematic unit, because that's where the Goths come together. But first, let's talk about the emblematic quarter, which is definitely in competition for the worst emblematic quarter in the game, the Tumulus. It provides +3 influence, +3 faith, at the cost of -10 stability. That is it. It doesn't exploit any nearby tiles, it doesn't have any adjacency bonuses, all you get is 3 influence and 3 faith. It's really bad. You're probably not going to be building this in any of your games. This is by far one of the worst emblematic quarters in the game. So that's all that needs to be said about that. So next up, the Gothic Cavalry, the emblematic unit. Gothic Cavalry is a heavy cavalry. It has 29 base combat strength. It does have a bit of a steep resource requirement. It requires 2 iron and 1 horse, so you need to keep that in mind before you ever pick the Goths, because this is critical to playing the Goths, is that you have access to their emblematic unit. So the Ransacker trait gives the Gothic Cavalry +3 combat strength when they're ransacking or fighting on enemy districts. The latter isn't as useful because of cavalry's interaction with fortifications, but the former combines with the Goth's legacy trait. So when you take the Gothic Cavalry and you with its base CS and you give it Ransacker and you give it the Goth's legacy trait, it means you have 37 combat strength when these units are ransacking. And then if you're ransacking and someone attacks you with the charge from the Gothic Cavalry, you can one-shot 20 strength units, right? Or if you get a charge and high ground, you can one-shot 24 strength units. So this is pretty good. And the Gothic Cavalry are going to be a real menace. They're real Terminators when they're actually out ransacking. And because they have the speed, the idea is that you run into enemy territory, you ransack their outposts, and you ransack their administrative centers. Now, unlike in later eras where those administrative centers are likely to be attached to the city with fortifications through connected districts, in the classical era, the cities are going to be much smaller. So being able to go and ransack is a much more viable strategy. And then what you do after you've destroyed the admin center or the outpost, you can just have your cavalry place down your own outpost and then run off and start ransacking a different one. And because influence is not as important in the classical era as it was in the ancient era, you're going to be less influence constrained, and you'll have the influence to actually take advantage of the outposts that you just ransacked. I should also mention that there are some civics that affect ransacking as well, and it's a choice between two. There's one that provides a +4 combat strength bonus on units that are ransacking at the cost of having minus 50% money generation from ransacking. And this is one that you can pick if you basically want to be completely unkillable when you're ransacking something. You can be an absolute terror, particularly to someone who is playing a really wide game. If you have a city, an enemy city that has, say, 6 attached outposts, oh, they're going to be in for a world of hurt because they're relying a lot on the FIMs that those outposts are producing in order to support their city. On the other side, you can also take the other side of the civic that gives you plus 50% money from ransacking at a cost of -4 strength. And because you have pretty strong units when you're ransacking already, you can still have a ransacking bonus to your combat strength even with the -4 that the civic gives you. So it gives you the ability to generate some gold. Now, gold isn't in a great place right now, so this is less useful than it might otherwise be, but it is something to consider. What I would say the trade-off is here is that if you are looking primarily to be a complete menace to other players, your strategy is to reduce the ability of your opponents to generate their own fame stars, then take the +4 combat strength civic. If you kind of want to do that, but you're also interested in building up your own infrastructure and building your own era stars more significantly, then you can take the extra money generation from ransacking. Now, a major disadvantage to these things, despite their strength, is that they don't really have a way to take cities, right? Because they're cavalry. But you can plop down the outposts on the territories you ransack if you're trying to get the expansion stars, so you can at least get a couple just by attaching some new territories to your already existing cities, or creating a new city on a tile that you already ransacked. So where do I put the Goths? In the open devs, I would have put the Goths in the D tier. The changes to ransacking were enough to put them up into C. They have a very unique playstyle compared to other cultures, but that playstyle isn't really as effective as most other playstyles. But the Goths do excel at doing it. So because it's still early in the game and most outposts won't be connected to cities via fortification, the ability to move quickly from territory to territory and plunder everything is still viable, unlike, say, in the industrial era when the cities are much bigger and fortifications and city districts dominate the landscape. You should be aware that if you are going to pick the Goths, the bonuses that you get from the Goths aren't really relevant to you for the rest of the game. So whatever you're going to do as the Goths, you have to do it in the classical era because all their stuff is mostly irrelevant once you leave the classical. They're less about generating a lot of stars themselves and really more about preventing their neighbors from doing so, but they're really, really good at it. The Goths do kind of combine with the Mongols for the ransack buffs, but ransacking is going to get harder as the game goes on because the issue I mentioned earlier, as cities expand, the outposts are going to be connected to the city via districts, preventing you from entering them and ransacking them. If you're taking the Mongols, you're also going double militarist, and the Mongols have a few issues themselves in the medieval era, so you can really be setting yourself back if that's the strategy that you choose to take. The Goths may be the closest thing that the Assyrians get to a culture combination. The Goths can benefit from that +1 movement speed in order to get to other outposts quickly to ransack them, but honestly, I'd rather just have the combat strength from the Hittites or the production and veterancy buff from the Mycenaeans. And if you're going for a pillage strategy and then you want to claim the territory that you just pillaged, then the Olmecs are actually an okay choice in the ancient era as well, because they have that extra influence generation in order to support a lot more outposts. So the Goths overall, C tier. They have a very unique strategy that can be somewhat effective in certain situations, but they're generally going to be less effective than most other cultures most of the time. Following up the Goths, we have the Greeks. They are a scientist affinity, and that means they have the ability to research texts into the next era, and it means that they can set their cities into this sort of science production mode where they are able to turn their money and their production into science. So a couple things to note here, just about the affinity specifically, is that the affinity is more powerful in the classical era than it was in the ancient, and that's for two reasons. The first is that because you have some infrastructure built up, you actually have the ability to use the scientist active to convert some stuff into science because you're no longer just laying your foundation. So if you want to prioritize science, you're able to do that on one of your cities, though you could potentially do more. The other is that the classical era really lacks generic units. So you're going to be using the same 3 units. You're going to be using your emblematic unit, you're going to use swordsmen, and you can potentially maybe use horsemen. And your emblematic unit is going to be better than it. So what this means is that as a scientist, your ability to go into the next era is a major, major boon to your military because you can get access to crossbowmen. The classical era lacks a generic ranged unit that you can use. So if you can tech up to crossbows, that provides a major benefit to being able to support your military in the field and defend against other players. It has other benefits too. It allows you to get more infrastructure and other things online, but the crossbowmen are really an important part, a really important component of the scientist affinity for the classical era. Now let's talk about the legacy trait, which is +2 science per researcher on city or outpost. I'm not sure why this says outpost. To my knowledge, you can't have a researcher on an outpost. But anyway, if you don't have the House of Scribes, +2 science per researcher is a 33% increase in the science generated from your scientists. And at the time you pick the Greeks, that's probably all of your science, right? So it's effectively a 33% science increase. If you do have the House of Scribes, it's about a 28% increase, which is still pretty good. Because pop scales pretty dramatically later into the game, and quite a few of those pops are going to continue to be assigned to research, this stays pretty relevant throughout the entire game, even if it provides proportionally less science later on. But science does have quite a few percentage modifiers, right? So there are some buildings that provide +10, +20% science, and that's going to affect the science that you're getting from this legacy trait as well. So specifically the alchemy tech is available in medieval, and you can rush that as the Greeks, and that gives you that +10% science. You can continue to snowball your science advantage. So the emblematic quarter, the amphitheatron, or what I'll call the amphitheater as we call it in English, it's a unique quarter that is effectively a research quarter with a couple differences. So rather than getting adjacency per research quarter, you just get adjacency per any district. On top of that, you get a flat science and influence that increases the longer into the game you go. So in the classical era, because you're 2 eras in, you actually get a base of +2 influence and +6 science from the amphitheater. And this eventually scales in the contemporary era up to +18 science and +6 influence. This is pretty good. You don't have to put a researcher on this either, so it keeps up and pacing with the researchers, though, by providing that scaling era science. And importantly, science quarters are something that you're going to be building anyway. And the amphitheater just represents something that is basically a little bit better of a research quarter and provides you a little bit extra influence. And that influence can come in handy once you get into the medieval and postmodern, when it becomes a little more difficult to start generating influence era stars. So a little bit of math on this is that assuming you have 40 turns per era and 10 turns, it takes you 10 turns to build one of these at the start of the classical, and you have just a single adjacent district throughout the entire game. So that means over the course of the game, that provides you with 2,680 science, and that's without accounting for any of the infrastructure. And in practice, this is going to be even more, right? And you're going to have multiple of these amphitheaters. So they provide you more science than the research quarter does. This is really quite effective. It allows you to boost your game and start researching those texts that you really want to prioritize, and it continues to help you throughout the game, even if it's less and less of your science as the game goes on. It does suffer a bit from the same problem as other adjacency-based districts in the game right now, because quarters have increased costs relative to the open dev, so it's harder to fully benefit from the adjacent districts. But because you're building this early on, this is going to be closer to your city core, and is more likely that you fill out those adjacencies over the course of the game. And you can kind of put this wherever, because it's not specific to science districts. You can drop this wherever you need something in your city. And if you really want that adjacency bonus, you can plop it next to agriculture's quarters or maker's quarters or whatever, and it doesn't make a difference to the amphitheater. So hoplites are the emblematic unit, and the hoplites unlock at standing army, which is one of the very first texts in the classical era at a cost of 400 science. So like many other cultures that get their emblematic unit at standing army, this is pretty attainable for the Greeks in the early stages of the classical. So hoplites can get online really early, and you're likely to be able to upgrade some spearmen from the ancient era directly into hoplites. So the hoplites themselves, they have a 1 coffer requirement, which isn't too bad. They have 28 base combat strength, which, you look at it, that's okay. But really the critical parts, they get 1 anti-cavalry, so they get a bonus combat strength when they're fighting mounted units, and there are a few dangerous ones of those in the classical era. And more importantly, they get phalanx, which grants them additional combat strength for each unit with the phalanx ability that's next to them. And this stacks with the normal adjacency bonus that you get for having friendly units next to each other. So, in my opinion, hoplites are probably the best overall classical era unit that you can get for a couple of reasons. The first is phalanx is an ability that's pretty much always going to be active. You don't have to worry about whether there's a cliff in between your units. You don't have to worry about whether or not you're on a district or on high ground. As long as your hoplites are next to each other, you are going to be getting the benefits of phalanx as well as the benefits of having adjacent units. In practice, this bonus is going to be like a +3 or a +4, depending on which unit you are and where the front line is. But theoretically, it's possible to get the +5 bonus from phalanx, which is pretty sizable. And of course, sometimes you can get like rear attacks and high ground and advantage and all that kind of stuff. But the reliability of phalanx means that they're very effective at both offense and defense. So on defense, you can hide behind your city walls, put your hoplites in front, and let the enemy come to you and try to grind you down. But it's going to be really ineffective because you're going to have the fortification bonuses and you're going to have considerable bonuses from phalanx and from adjacent units. On the offense, it means that you can stack up your hoplites against the wall and run into the enemy and be able to trade evenly or better because you're getting such good adjacency bonuses that are always going to be active. So even the elephants in this era can struggle a little bit because of the anti-cavalry bonus. The Samnaya from the Mauryans, they don't have the cavalry tag, but I believe the bonus still applies. I didn't get to test this in the closed beta, but I do recall in the open dev that the hoplites and anti-cavalry in general did work against the Somnia. So I believe that applies there, which actually makes them really good because those are one of the most dangerous units in the era. So really the only comparable unit on defense is the Immortal because of the Bastion effect, but the hoplites are just better because when you have more hoplites, they increase the value of the hoplite increases proportionally to the number of hoplites that you have. So the more of them you have, the better you are, and that's not true with the Immortals. So they really excel at grinding down enemies. You can keep cycling out your low health units out of the front line, and you keep bringing up your higher health units, and you keep that adjacency bonus in a tight formation. So the Greeks. The Greeks are a little sneaky. The hoplite really makes them a bit of a warmonger civilization that is disguised as a scientist. Because really they're one of the best overall cultures for playing aggressively in the classical. They get early access to a really powerful unit with really consistent bonuses that can be used both aggressively and defensively. And then the ability of your tech, bolstered by both your legacy trait that scales into the game, your amphitheater that scales later into the game, allows you to get access to crossbows before anyone else can, which is a major benefit because archers really lose viability in the classical era. So you have not only your hoplites, but later on, as some more dangerous units start coming out, you have the ability to support your hoplites with range attacks. So the Greeks are quite versatile, really, and they can combine pretty easily with just about every other culture. There are a couple of notable possibilities. One is if you have a lot of mountains, the Zhou are quite good because it enables a really high early science output to take advantage of being able to tech up to crossbows quickly or whatever other tech that you're interested in. Whoops. And the sorry, I lost my place here. A couple options are the Mycenaeans and the Hittites. They can both work pretty well if you plan to play aggressively with hoplites, because you can get that extra veterancy and production bonus or that +1 combat strength. And then, of course, you have the Harappans, who can really play well into anyone, but the Harappans support a higher population, so that means you can have more researchers, which means you can benefit more from the Greeks' legacy trait. So overall, Greeks are really effective at producing science. They're also a very effective warmonger civ. And science in particular really allows you to do kind of anything. It's not as versatile as the Celts. It's not quite as effective as the Celts. But the Greeks have a lot of overall strength. There's nothing about them that is bad. In fact, everything about them is quite a bit above average. And there's no game in which you're going to do yourself wrong by picking the Greeks. So next, as you might have seen from my little whoopsie, is the Huns. The Huns are a militarist culture, which means they get that extra war support when they're going to war, and they can raise levies, which you'll probably never do as the Huns. But the war support is really helpful because you are going to be doing a lot of war. So the legacy trait for the Huns, +3 combat strength on cavalry, including light and heavy, as well as +3 combat strength on mounted nomad, which means the Hunnic horde as well as the Mongol horde in the medieval era if you choose to tech up into the Mongols. So, this is a bonus that is mostly relevant in the era that you pick it and after. There are a few cavalry units in the early modern and industrial if you take the right cultures, but the selection is pretty limited after medieval. So you have to take advantage of this basically when you get it. And then there's the additional effect that as cities expand and take up the larger portions of the map, the value of cavalry declines because of their inability to attack over walls. Luckily, when you pick the Huns, this is not going to be a problem quite yet. So this trait can really help you snowball really effectively by picking up a bunch of cities. though you may run into a bit of a problem with city cap that's going to tank your influence. As I mentioned, this does have some natural synergy with the Mongols, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend that in every situation, and we can talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So let's look at the emblematic quarter, the Ordu. This is an outpost replacement, and really there are two effects of this. The first is that the Huns cannot attach their outposts to their cities while they're in the classical era. So if you're picking the Huns, make sure you have everything attached that you need before you pick the Huns. The other thing that the Ordu lets you do is you can produce the Hunnic horde. Okay, so that means this has a couple benefits. This means that you're forward producing your units closer to your enemy so you can get to them earlier. But it also means that you are saving production on your cities to produce other things like infrastructure or quarters that are going to help you get the outputs that you need to get other era stars. So it helps you save a little bit of production in the areas that you actually need it. That's about all there is to the Ordu. So let's talk about the Hunnic horde. And this is the reason that you pick the Huns, right? With the Huns traits, this goes up to 25 combat strength. And just to describe how this works, in case you're not aware, which I'm sure you probably are, the hordes move in with their high movement. They shoot their bow at someone so the enemy can't retaliate. And then with move and fire, they run away so that enemy can't attack them back. It is a really effective strategy, and the bigger the battlefield, the better the Hunnic hordes are. So the ability to move after shooting also allows you to focus fire much more capably than other units. And even in an area where there is a choke point, you can run into that choke point and cycle your unit back out and cycle all of your hordes through that one choke point. So you can take advantage of every single unit. So it's very, very hard to control the Hunnic hordes, particularly with the tech available in the classical era, I should say. But it's important to keep something in mind, which is that they only have one range. So if you are attacking a city that is 2 tiles thick, you have to go around to the other side to shoot enemies. This isn't really that big of a deal because you have a lot of movement on the Hunnic hordes, so you can make that adjustment pretty easily. But in a location that's 3 tiles thick, in other words, a tile that has a district developed on all sides of that tile, you won't be able to hit the middle tile. So as long as there is one unit in a siege that can sit on that tile, you won't be able to attack it or take the city. You could potentially get battering rams, but that's going to slow you down quite a bit. And battering rams are really quite vulnerable. They'll probably get destroyed before you can destroy the fortifications. So one thing to keep in mind, though, this situation is not going to be very common when you pick the Huns. Quarters are difficult to get out at the start of the game. They have a pretty high production cost. And the way that exploitation works encourages players to build snaky rather than condensed cities. They want to get as many exploitations as they can. If you're playing against a player and someone sees you take the Huns, they might start to develop their city more. So take that into consideration. One of the counters to the Huns is having a city that is thick enough that the Hunnic horde can't shoot all the tiles within it. So if you see a situation like that, it is worthwhile to bring a few backup melee units such that you can get into the city and ensure you take the city. Despite their drawbacks, the Hunnic hordes are really, really dominant. And one of the biggest reasons for this is that they unlock the moment that you pick the Huns. So you don't have to worry about technology costs, and you can start producing the hordes the moment that you era up. So what this means is that you can take whatever culture you want in the ancient era, and it can be a culture that allows you to generate really, really fast era stars. As soon as you hit 7 era stars, you era up into the Huns and start pumping out Hun Accords. And this is something that's possible by turn 30, turn 35 for players, if you really, really focus on it. You do sacrifice stars in the ancient era, but you have possibly the most effective rush in the game, because in the ancient era, there aren't any real counters to the Hunnic horde. The archers don't do enough damage. The spearmen are too slow to catch up to you. Perhaps the Mahabharata from the chariot unit from the Egyptians might be able to do a little bit to you, but the Hunnic horde is going to absolutely destroy ancient era units. And I have seen some people comparing the Hunnic horde to its contemporaries. But the issue is that that's not how you should be using the Hunnic hordes. The Hunnic hordes are for a rush, where you sacrifice the era stars in the ancient to get these Hunnic hordes out as fast as possible to rush down your neighboring cultures. That's how you use these things. So you're almost always going to be up against the previous era of units. And even into the early classical era, they're still effective. There's not much that swordsmen can do, and some of the other units are too stationary to really chase after the horde. So Hunnic hordes are insanely dominant. Do watch out for Carthage. The war elephants have the movement and the power to really destroy you. And the Mauryans as well, because their elephants have that same movement, and they have 3 range with a really strong attack. So be careful around those 2 cultures. The other thing with the Hunnic horde as well is that because you get more hordes through winning battles, you don't need to worry too much about producing them. So this, again, like the Ordu, saves you production in your main cities. So although you don't have any direct buffs to your FIMS output, because you're not too worried about actually building your units, you're able to produce other things that help boost your FIMS. So it's a bit of an indirect boost to your actual FIMS, although there isn't really anything that scales, right? So you're not getting like a +2 industry per worker kind of thing. It's just something that helps you in the classical era when you would otherwise be producing units. So where does that put the Huns? I put the Huns in the A tier. The reason they are not in the S tier is twofold. I feel like I have to justify not putting them in S tier. So the Huns take a hit because they don't have any capacity to generate era score independently of other players, right? So they rely on conquest. So your capacity to generate era score is always going to be dependent on how well the other players are playing the game. However, the conquest is what they do, right? They're very, very effective at it. The other thing is that the Huns are basically hard countered by having a city that is dense enough that the Hunnic horde can't shoot all the tiles in the city. But because you can get the Hun so early and the Hunnic hordes online so early, it means that this is a very unlikely situation to happen. But it can. I think they fit pretty well with the definition for A tier, because they're really not a culture that you can pick in every single game. I think you kind of need to get into the game, explore around a little bit, and think about really the viability of picking the Huns. Because if you pick them in a bad situation, they're probably more like a D or a C tier. And particularly if you're waiting a really long time to go up into the classical era so you can get all the ancient era stars, they're not going to be as effective because other people are going to be getting their emblematic units online at the same time that you get yours. And the Hunnic hordes are weaker combat strength than most of the other units, so they're going to be much more capable of defending themselves. So, I slotted them into A tier. They're perfectly capable of taking cities, and they can be really effective in the right situation, but they're not always going to be the right pick. So, a couple other notes is that this is not a culture that you're going to pick if you're the kind of player that's going for max era stars, right? Because you're kind of sacrificing your ancient era stars in order to get the Huns really early, and you're probably going to be sacrificing your cultural or your classical era stars in order to advance an era into whatever culture you want after the Huns, right? You want to sort of shock and awe your opponents, take a bunch of cities, and then era up into something that's going to give you more advantages to keep snowballing. And it is tempting to pick the Mongols after the Huns because of the Mongol hordes. I would caution against this in most situations. The Mongols are not generally going to be as impactful for a couple reasons I mentioned before, because cities are going to be more developed. And the Mongol hordes have are much more effectively countered by classical era units than Hunnic hordes are by ancient era units. And then eventually, because the crossbow is quite early in the medieval tech tree, the crossbow can really help shut down Mongol horde shenanigans. But using the Huns with the Hunnic hordes, you can get your militarist and expansionist era stars very early, which can allow you to get into medieval very early. And if you're able to do that and get the Mongol hordes out while people are still just starting to build their classical era units, the Mongol hordes can allow you to continue the snowball even farther. You do have to be a little bit cognizant of your city cap. In that situation, you can really tank your influence, but as long as you're able to keep up with some of the city cap techs, you should be okay. There are a couple other synergies that you could get. Some other obvious ones are the Mycenaeans and Hittites again, like many of the other warmonger civs. And the Huns are someone that can kind of age up into anyone else. And I would suggest doing that in most situations. You want to start getting your FIMS outputs online in the different cities that you captured. Next up, the Mauryans. So the Mauryans are an aesthete culture, which historically I understand why it was picked, but it doesn't make a lot of sense with how the culture is built, and we'll get into that a little bit. So the aesthetes have two things. Their active ability allows them to culture bomb, which means they can convert territory to their own culture. It has to be their own territory. The passive means that they always have cultural proximity with all other nations. And this has a few effects. One, it makes you more able to get alliances and that kind of stuff because of cultural affinity. And it makes enemies have lower war score or war support if they want to declare war on you. That is a two-sided sword, though, because it means that you have less war support if you want to declare war on your enemies. And this will come up in a few minutes. So the legacy trait for the Mauryans is plus 10 science per independent people under patronage and plus 10 faith per independent people under patronage. Patronage is interesting. So going into the classical, it's not unrealistic to have 2 to 3 independent people under patronage, as well as be at your city cap, right? So you don't necessarily want to go over your city cap all the time, even if capturing those cities would be more beneficial to you. So you can go in with 2 to 3 cities, get plus 20 science and plus 20 faith per turn. But after the classical era, these independent people mostly disappear. So once you leave the classical, you're not really getting anything out of your legacy trait because all these independent people are either going to be going to disappear or get taken over by someone. And eventually it's going to hit the point where it's more beneficial for you to take out the cities of independent people or to absorb them than it is to just get your 10 science and 10 faith from being their patron. But say you have 3 people under patronage for 40 turns, which is something you can do. They don't get integrated by another player. You're looking at about 1,200 science and 1,200 faith. And the faith aspect of this is quite significant. Mauryans can generate a lot more faith than anyone else in the classical era by having a few independent people under patronage. And this enables them to get to higher tiers of tenants more quickly and allows them to make some interesting combinations into the next era. So it is something that you can do with like the Teutons or that kind of stuff if you're playing a religious focus game. So let's go to the emblematic quarter, the stupa. This is kind of a research district. You get your researcher slot, you get a base of +3 science, and it exploits science. But then it also gives you +1 influence, +2 faith, and then +2 influence per adjacent district. It's an okay building. It helps provide a little bit of influence, faith, and science, which are all things that the Mauryans want to generate anyway. The influence to meet their era stars, the faith to synergize with their strong faith output from having independent people, and then science is obviously good for everyone, and again synergizes with the output from having independent people under patronage. The outputs aren't amazing, and there isn't a lot of scaling here throughout the game. You just get a little extra influence from adjacent districts. It is still worth getting because you're functionally getting a research quarter with a few extra add-ons, but it's not something you should rely on to really, boost you up above other players. There are much better emblematic quarters out there. So next up, for the Mauryans, I'm not sure on the pronunciation of this, the Samnaya. Anyway, it is a ranged elephant unit, and this is really the reason that you take this culture. It is probably one of, if not the best emblematic unit in the classical because of its combat effectiveness. So it has 30 base strength, it has a ranged attack which prevents enemy retaliation, it has no combat penalty to fighting in melee, and it has 3 range. This thing is a beast. So unlike the Hunnic hordes, these can shoot past city walls, right? So you're not going to be deterred by enemies just because they have a somewhat thick city in terms of number of districts. They also have no resource requirements, which is a little strange. Most, if not all, of the other elephants do have a resource requirement. So it's a little odd to see this without. But it means that you can always be able to produce this regardless of what your start is, which is actually a pretty good benefit, particularly in the classical era when the resource cost to produce these units starts to increase. Now, I didn't get to test this. I do believe any cavalry get their bonus against this, even though they don't have the cavalry tag, but I am not 100% on that. I'm pretty sure they do. But it does make things like hoplites and immortals something of a counter to these, because they kind of want to sit there and just shoot people, and the hoplites and immortals can really meet them and match them strength for strength and get some bonuses against them. The Carthaginian war elephants are another thing to watch out for. They're harder to get online than these things, but they do have some pretty good bonuses that can keep you on your toes. And then the Praetorians are dangerous to all classical units, but they come much later, so they're not as much of a concern. Where these things really suffer is that they're unlocked at a dead-end technology that costs 1,000 research that you wouldn't otherwise care about if you didn't have this emblematic unit. And they're kind of expensive to produce. So if you want to go with the Mauryans, what you're really looking at doing is producing some early archers and then upgrading them as soon as you get the tech so that you can make use of them immediately. So with this unit, the Mauryans are really a warlike culture that are disguised as aesthetes. They use their science that they get from independent people to unlock their emblematic unit earlier that they can use to take over enemy cities. The problem is that they're not as effective as the Huns are at doing this. And the reason for that is because the unit is locked behind the technology. So you're getting it later. And that means two things. One, obviously you're taking over cities later, which means you're not benefiting from all the outputs that they provide, and you're not able to control the development of that city. The second thing is, because you're getting it later, your opponents are more likely to have their own emblematic units available in the classical era, which means you can be facing down soft or hard counters like hoplites or immortals or the Carthaginian war elephants. So this reduces the overall viability of the Samnihaya to take cities because enemies are more able to defend against it. And it takes you longer to actually get them out and online and be able to attack your foes with them. So overall, that puts the Mauryans at a B tier. They are largely looking to do the same thing as the Huns, but it takes them longer to do it. Although their unit is more powerful and it'll stay relevant for longer, it also means that the tech cost also means that other cultures are more easily able to counter it. Whereas with the Huns, it is a lot harder to develop in such a way that you're able to deal with a full stack of Hunnic Accord on turn 30 or 35. So the Mauryans, effective militarists, they can be effective, and they are quite dangerous. Look out for them if you have them as a neighbor. But they can struggle a bit relative to others. Sorry about that. So one potential way around this, though, if you are constructing like a very specific strategy, is that you can pick the Babylonians and grab the text you need for your emblematic unit in the ancient era, such that when you era up, you can immediately start producing them, right? And that makes it a lot more effective for a rush. In practice, I haven't been able to test this, so I don't know how viable it is, but in theory, it should work. There is less flexibility than with the Huns, though, because you need to be able to get the Babylonians first in order to pursue that strategy. The Mauryans also do have that niche sort of religion game that allows them to get ahead on tenants and really push religion early, and that can help them generate grievances to go to war, which is perhaps an underrated part of religion. So that's in part negated by permanent cultural proximity, but it kind of balances out a little bit. Religion overall is somewhat weak and doesn't really provide the same level of bonuses like it did in the open devs. But the Mauryans do synergize pretty well with the Teutons in the medieval. They can spread their religion very rapidly, and then once you switch to the Teutons, you can start getting some more tangible benefits to your religion based on the number of territories that are following it. Now, if the Mauryans could get their unit from the moment they picked the civilization, they would be an S-tier culture. But the technology requirement really slows them down, and their ability to rush is not as powerful as the Huns. So this, like I said before, this leaves them at a B tier. They're still really effective. They're good on the battlefield. They can take cities. But their effectiveness relative to some of the other cultures isn't as strong. So next are the Maya. So the Mayans are a builder culture, and unlike in the ancient era when you're trying to get your cities online and really need the science and the money, you can actually make use of your active ability here to convert science and money into production, because it's not as critical that you have that going on like your one developed city. So that's an advantage to the builder affinity. You're also going to be pretty reliably able to meet your 3 stars. Now, on the legacy trait, the wording of the legacy trait seems to imply that it applies to any district that produces industry and not just makers' quarters or like emblematic quarters that are basically makers' quarters. So that would include things like, the Nubian pyramid or the Egyptian pyramid. It would include things like the Commons quarter if you have the criminal slaves civic. Whether or not that's how it actually works, I haven't been able to test. But assuming it works as it's worded, you can do some cute stuff where you take like the Egyptians and the Mayans and go into the English in order to get +6 industry on farmers' quarters, though I probably wouldn't suggest that. So the +2 industry is kind of nice, Most of your production in the earlier ages is going to come from exploitations rather than from the districts themselves. So this helps produce, boost your industry a little bit. If you have 10 makers quarters, you're getting plus 20 industry, which is a little bit better than a single well-placed makers quarter, getting some good exploitations. It's a decent effect, but it's nothing amazing. It does help get your production rolling a little earlier, though, and it does have some scaling throughout the game as you get more districts. So now the reason to pick the Maya, which is the emblematic quarter, the Kuna. It is a pretty solid quarter, and it works better the taller you're playing your civ. So it exploits production. It gets plus 4 industry from adjacent makers' quarters for a max of plus 24 in the district without considering infrastructure. It gets an additional plus 2 from the Mayan trait. And then, the important part about it, it gets plus 3 from the number of territories in the city that you've built it. The extra faith is a little nice too and helps you spread your religion a bit, but it's not super significant. So the plus 3 industry from territories is the real meat of this. So a city with 2 territories is only going to get plus 6, but a city with 4 territories, which is reasonable for your first 2 cities in the classical, is going to get plus 12 for each kuna. So if you build one of these in every single one of your territories in which they're available, in one of your cities with 4 territories, you're going to get plus 48 production just from the territory alone. And that's not including things like the adjacency bonus. It's not including whatever tiles you're exploiting. And your cities really want quite a few makers' quarters, regardless of your culture. And this is just a quarter that is a better makers' quarter. You're going to want to build this quarter anyway. And this gives you additional benefits to building that quarter. Is it game-breaking? No. Is it something that puts you so far ahead of other cultures that they can't keep up? No, not really. And the reason for that is that production is less versatile than pops. It doesn't, it doesn't help you with research. It doesn't help you with growth. It does in the sense that, if you have more production, you can build more of these other things. But you have to keep in mind that the production costs of stuff scale over time, just like everything else. So although you're adding production, you're also adding to the cost of producing things every time you build a quarter. And although this is really effective, and it'll get you good production, no doubt about it, but it's not really enough to propel you to such a location that, you're far and away above other cultures. So let's talk about the unit, which is the Noble Javelineer. And for a note here, I believe this was updated to be range 2 rather than range 3, which is pretty important actually, because it dramatically affects the capabilities of the unit. Because if you only have 2 range, even if you reduce the enemy range by 1, if they're a 3 range unit, they can still attack you back, right? And the movement speed reduction is only really useful against high movement targets. But they have enough movement that they can just stay away from ever getting hit by you in the first place. So the poison effect, not great. The range being 2 means you can only have 1 supporting line rather than 2. But it does have 25 base strength, which can make them fairly effective at actually defending your territory. You can have a line of swordsmen in the front surrounding them, preventing the enemy from scaling the walls, and using the Noble Javelineers to cut them down from inside your city. Like other ranged units, it also means you can plink away at defenders if you're assaulting someone, but they're not nearly as effective at that as most of the other units in the era. I'm a little sour on these because I'm not really sure what niche they're supposed to fill. Having a higher CS archer in the classical is kind of helpful, but a reduced range and poison effects makes it less impactful. Most of the battles you'll fight are either going to be grind fests where the poison doesn't matter because there's minimal movement and the -1 attack range serves no purpose, or the enemy is doing like hit and run tactics, in which case the Javelineers won't be able to hit the enemy consistently anyway. In my opinion, this unit needs like more range or a different effect in order to truly be useful. So overall, it's okay for defending cities just by nature of being a higher CS range unit in the classical era where there aren't any sort of common ranged units. And, it can kind of wear down city defenses over several turns, but, you're going to be in danger because of enemy emblematic units in that case. Personally, I'd honestly rather have the Egyptian Makabata than the Noble Javelineers because I can use move and fire with that. It's more effective. So overall, the Mayans, I put them in the B tier, which might be a little controversial. I think I've seen a lot of people in the A tier that are really valuing the production of the Kuna, and that's fine. I think you can make an argument for A tier, but the Noble Javelineer is not great. It's just okay. The legacy trait is okay. The Kuna does quite a bit for the culture. You can get a pretty sizable amount of industry online. But industry isn't enough to propel you. In my opinion, the Mayans are just too focused on just industry alone. They don't enable you to really go out and capture cities. In most eras, production is really valuable. But in the classical era, it's less valuable towards producing units because there are fewer different types of units available that have a decent combat strength relative to the emblematic units. And the Mayans don't have an emblematic unit where they can really roll over other cultures. So this is going to constrain them in terms of generating quite a few of the era stars. It's going to constrain them both for the militarist and the expansionist stars, but also it's going to constrain them for things like the agrarian stars, because when you take enemy cities, those pops count towards your agrarian stars, and you won't be able to get all the infrastructure you want online in cities you might be able to capture with another culture. So the Mayans, they're good at building tall. You can get a lot of production with them, but they do have limitations that hold them back from really being an A tier culture, in my opinion. Now they do have some combinations. Ancient era, an obvious pick are the Egyptians to really amass that production. Less obviously are the Zhou on a mountain-heavy map, which can provide the stability you need to get even more benefits out of your emblematic quarter. What I mean by that is that because you're getting less stability penalty from your quarters when you pick the Zhou, it means you can attach more territories to your cities. That means that the Mayans, when they're building their emblematic quarter, they can get more production from those extra attached outposts. The Olmecs can also help in that regard by generating enough influence to attach more territories to benefit from. Now, going into the next era, as the Mayans, the Khmer are a pretty obvious pick to continue the builder streak, and really the Khmer are a solid all-around pick for anyone because you'll have more worker slots in your cities than others, and the legacy trait can really help benefit you. The Beret is a great district that'll help you on growth, and particularly as builders, that's going to be something you might struggle with a bit compared to some of the other cultures. So Mayans, B tier, they have some good synergies. They're solid. You're probably never going to be upset playing them. You can leverage them to your advantage in several ways, but they're not as effective as something like the Greeks or the Celts. And I'd say that they're about on par with cultures like the Achaemenids and Aksumites, but they are more versatile than the Mauryans and Carthage, which are more specialist cultures. Finally, we come to the Romans. Rome is an expansionist affinity, which makes total sense, so they can freely trespass and steal people's outposts. They don't really have any unique interactions with the expansionist affinity. The affinity is fine. Rome can fill the stars easily once they get the Praetorians, so we don't need to talk about the affinity too much. However, the legacy trait is, honestly, it's really bad. Because the problem with the legacy trait is that it's really just a quality of life improvement and doesn't have any impact on the actual game. And the reason for this is because instead of having, say you, with the Romans, you can have 5 units in your army. Instead, you can just have 4 units in your army and have an army with 1 additional unit following it around. Excuse me. And the reason for this is because when your army is attacked, reinforcing armies that are adjacent, you can deploy them immediately. Whereas when you're attacking, the fact that they're reinforcements doesn't matter, right? And then furthermore, when you're defending, which is the only really conceivable way or place that the fact that it's a reinforcement rather than in the army matters, when you're defending, there's a limited number of units that are actually usable on the battlefield at any given time. So if you're in a defensive position where there's, say, a 2-tile choke point for the enemy to get through, and you have 4 units in your army, and they're Praetorians or whatever they are, it doesn't matter that you don't have access to the 5th unit, because you can just bring them in as a reinforcement after the enemy takes their turn. But also, you should be avoiding defensive battles in the first place, because going first is such a massive advantage. It allows you to block enemy reinforcements. You can strategically take out priority enemy targets before your opponent can use them. So you should always be looking to go first, regardless. And when you're going first, when you are the one doing the attacking, it means that whether or not something is a reinforcement doesn't really matter. And in the event you're actually taking a defensive battle, it's probably in terrain that is actually favorable to you, where you can clog up choke points and use your units to the full effect. So, +1 unit slot available for each army. It's quality of life. If you're a good player and you know how to manage your armies, you don't separate them, you have a few moving alongside of each other, it doesn't matter, because there's no general that gives an effect to the entire army. There's no increased upkeep cost for different armies. All units just have a base upkeep. So overall, +1 unit slot available for each army, not impactful. Next up, the Triumphal Arch. Again, this is a terrible, terrible emblematic quarter. It's in competition for one of the worst emblematic quarters in the game. You're paying for -7 stability and +3 influence as a base. If you win a war, you get +8 influence and +3 stability for 10 turns. Why does this matter? It's so conditional, and you have to constantly win wars to trigger such a minor influence boost. Sure, if you have 4 of them, you can make 320 influence over the duration of your victorious buff. But why would you do that when you can just build a commons quarter that always provides positive stability, a flat +5 influence that isn't conditional, and then gets upgraded to +7 influence with later techs? And you can even get a little production on it with the right civic. This emblematic quarter might as well not exist. The Romans don't have an emblematic quarter. So let's talk about what the Romans actually do well, which is their emblematic unit. So this is the Praetorians. They have 33 base combat strength, which I believe is the highest in the classical era. Then they get an effect, tactical superiority, where whenever you have a unit that's adjacent to an enemy unit, the Praetorians get the effect of a toned down rear attack on that unit. And it says +5 on the wiki right now, but I believe this was actually reduced to +3 in the closed beta. So this unit, it'll benefit from the adjacent units like everyone else. You're probably going to have a full army full of Praetorian Guard. You get 33 base strength. You get +3 from attacking an enemy that's adjacent to one of your own units. These guys are the premier meat grinders of the classical era. You can just run in, you beat the enemy down, you take over their cities, and you move on and you do it again. But they suffer from a major problem which is that they are really far into the tech tree, which leads to a significant delay in getting them out the door. And I'm going to show you what I mean. So here's a toned down tech tree from the wiki. So in the classical era, you have these 3 tiers of tech. And the place where you unlock Praetorians is imperial power. So let's look at all the different techs that you need to get there. The first is standing army, which is 400 science. Standing army is where 5 of the cultures in the game unlock their emblematic unit. So they're getting their emblematic unit and a power spike very early into the classical era, and it only costs them 400 science, which is quite achievable when you enter the era. Now the Romans, they also need to get conquest. What does conquest do? Pretty much nothing. Conquest provides you no tangible benefits as the Romans. You get a little bonus to ransacking, and that's pretty much it. And you get a flat bonus infrastructure that you're never going to build because it's useless. Then, after you unlock conquest, you need to unlock imperial power, which is over 2100 science. So this is an increase of 5 times over standing army. So in order to get to imperial power, you have to have quite a bit of science, and you're suffering the opportunity cost of not researching all the other useful technologies in this era, like philosophy and rhetoric to improve your science, like hydrology to increase your stability in your production, and craftsmanship to also increase your production. So by the time you get to this technology, everyone else has been running around and playing with their emblematic units for probably half or more of the era already. So while the Praetorians are really strong and they can come out onto the field and really dominate, the fact that you get them so late means that your enemies are going to have bigger and possibly more powerful armies than you, and you're taking over enemy cities really late. Now, they are good, don't get me wrong, and there are a couple of ways around this. One of those ways is taking the Babylonians. The Babylonians, because they can research tech into the next era, can start getting into standing army and potentially something like conquest early on in the ancient era so that you can really rush for imperial power. And you'll actually see in some of the videos on YouTube, a lot of the people getting high scores actually did go for a Roman strategy in the classical era, like 18,000, 19,000 fame kind of stuff, because of the power of the Praetorians going out and being able to take over the world. However, like I mentioned before, it's a different game when you're playing the same scenario over and over, because you knew you could get the Romans every time. So taking Babylon into Rome depends on you being able to get both of those cultures when you want them. So it is a very situational niche. You have to be able to get both of those things in order for it to work. Other than that, it's really hard to get the Praetorians out of the door. And by the time you do, other cultures are starting to get ready to get into the medieval era and push out some crossbows. And while those aren't a hard counter to Praetorians, it's going to significantly decrease their effectiveness. So overall, I put the Romans in the C tier. A little bit of poetry with them sitting in the C tier with the Goths. So what do we actually get with the Romans? We get a trait that's a quality of life feature but doesn't actually affect gameplay. We get an emblematic district that doesn't exist, and we get an emblematic unit that, while really strong, comes too late in the tech tree to be as impactful as any of the other cultures. The only thing pushing the Romans up to a C from a D is the outrageous strength of Praetorians. They come late, but they can still make a mess of your opponents. There are some possibilities to tech rush this with the Joe or Babylon, but it's much less consistent than the Mauryans or the Huns or the Greeks, and to a lesser extent the Achaemenids. And those are all capable of fielding dangerous armies earlier in the era. Not only that, but those cultures have other options available to them for the most part. The Greeks and the Achaemenids don't need to expand in order to be effective. finally, if you heavily invested in technology to support getting Praetorians, then this is a situational pick, right? This is something that you have to beeline from the start of the game. You have to know you're going for it. And as I mentioned before, it's not something you can guarantee every single time. So Rome's a one-trick pony. As soon as you pick Rome, your neighbors are going to prepare, and they have a lot more time to prepare than with any other aggressive culture. You may be able to smash their defenses anyway with the Praetorian, but the fact that they're going to be catching up in technology and unlocking crossbows means that, right, you have a pretty limited, narrow window in which to actually make use of your Praetorians. So this is our final tier list. We're going to start from the S tier, summarize each culture a little bit, and work our way down the list. So first, let's start with the Celts. The Celts are the first and only S tier culture in the classical. The Gazzetti, the Celts emblematic unit, they're a swordsman replacement. It isn't really very good. It has lower base combat strength than the swordsman, opting instead to not take combat strength penalties from losing health. But in an era where there are only 2 generic units and a lot of really powerful emblematic units, the Gazzetti really struggles, but it does benefit a bit from not requiring iron. The Celts trait provides +2 food on districts producing food, which is a nice little boost, but ultimately not super impactful if you don't have a ton of farmers' quarters, which you probably won't. The Celts are insane because of the emblematic districts, and I go over a little bit of the math on that in the section on the Celts. The short version is that in a city with 3 of these nemetons, which is pretty obtainable in the classical, you only need 3 territories in the city, you're going to be saving yourself from 10 to 15 farmers on a 50 pop city, or you're going to save yourself the need to produce a bunch more farmers' quarters. So this can allow you to accumulate tens of thousands of production over the course of the game, or money or science, whatever your preferred output is. And the district helps support all the different pops that you're going to be stealing using the agrarian affinity. In Humankind, pops are important, pops are power. They're the most versatile things in the game because you can put them towards any type of FIMs and you can use them to produce military. So Celts are S tier. The Greeks are our first A tier, and they're actually a bit of a warmonger culture disguised as a scientist. So they get a +2 science on researcher legacy trait, and that remains relevant throughout the game. It represents when you get it about a 33% boost to your science output, assuming it's all based on scientists. The Amphitheatron, which I'll call the Amphitheater, emblematic district, is a research quarter that provides more science and some bonus influence that scales the longer the game goes on. Well, it's not amazing. It is a better version of a district that you're going to want to build anyway, and it'll help you get the era stars and tech up a little bit faster. Now, the Hoplites, the emblematic unit, are one of the best units in the classical. They get anti-cavalry and additional combat bonuses from being adjacent to other Hoplites, which stacks with the normal adjacent unit bonuses. This makes them really versatile for both attack and defense because you can consistently get their combat strength to higher levels. Farther, with the Greeks being a scientist culture, you can tech up to crossbows while still in the classical era, which provides an important power spike, and you can use them to support your hoplites until you're ready to take the next culture. The second A-tier culture are the Huns. The Huns are a bit of a one-trick pony, and they don't provide any benefits to any of your outputs, instead relying on capturing an enemy city, and ideally multiple cities, in order to boost your game. Luckily, they are very, very effective at doing this. Because the Hunnic Horde has no tech cost, a player can age up to the classical as soon as they hit 7 stars and start pumping out hordes at their now upgraded outposts. This horde can then propagate by winning battles, which you'll do a lot of, and when you get them, there aren't many, if any, realistic counters on the field. You can have these things out at turn 30 and absolutely run wild. Of course, this comes with the drawback that you can't attach outposts during this era, so make sure you have enough of them before you era up. The legacy trait giving cavalry combat strength is relevant in the era you get it. It applies to your hordes, and it'll be relevant in the medieval with knights and such. However, after that, you're not really getting any bonuses from the legacy trait. So the Huns have a crazy snowball that they can get going. They can capture a lot of cities. They can get these really powerful units out before enemies have any counters. But if you don't make use of the Hunnic hordes, then they are an absolutely useless civilization. So, A tier because they are very, very effective at what they do, better than anyone else. Achaemenids. Starting off the B tier for us, you have the Achaemenids with +2 city cap from the legacy trait. This is always going to be useful whether you're founding cities or taking enemy cities. And the immortals that they get as an emblematic unit are pretty good too, particularly on the defense. Where the Achaemenids suffer a little bit is that they are an expansionist culture with a defensive unit. Although the Immortals' higher base combat strength can help you take cities, they're less effective at doing it than many of the other emblematic units of the era, and the Classical era only provides swordsmen and horsemen as generic units, and the swordsmen are a little bit weaker than your Immortals anyway. So this makes it a little bit harder to generate some of the expansionist stars compared to the other cultures, and the expansionist stars are your primary era stars. However, the Achaemenids do have the Satrap Palace, which provides some money and influence, but most importantly, provides money per trade route. While you're likely to be in several wars in the Classical era, so you won't have quite as many friendly trading partners, as you era up, this combines well really nicely with the Ghanaians in the next era to make a lot of money. Of course, the value of money is now declined based on increased money costs, but the quarter's still good, but it's not as useful as it used to be. So the Achaemenids I placed in B tier. The Aksumites, on the other hand, are a merchant culture that dabble a little bit in the faith game. Their trait nets you a little extra money from ongoing trade, which you're going to do anyway and will help you get your money era stars. The Great Obelisk emblematic quarter provides some base money and the normal market quarter adjacency bonuses, as well as +3 faith. But the important part is that it generates +1 money for territory that is under your religion's influence. This is really good if you have a strong religion. You can generate a fair amount of cash, and it'll continue to increase your money as your religion spreads throughout the game. Because you're less dependent on trade to generate money, you also get the advantage that your income is going to be more stable. And this can even make for a nice synergy going into the Teutons in the next era. Now, the emblematic unit, the Shodalai, is a little interesting. It's functionally a +2 swordsman when you're playing against the AI. It does have the grappler ability, which means it has a larger zone of control that can't be ignored. The AI tend to sit there and meat grind, so it's difficult to ascertain how helpful this is. So it's going to depend on interactions with some different mechanics in the game, and we're not going to know the real power of this unit until we see it in action in multiplayer. So the Aksumites are a solid all-around civilization. They're able to generate their era stars with relative ease. And the Shodalai, well, it's not great, at least against the AI. It is capable of defense, being a higher combat strength swordsman. Carthaginians are the next in the B tier. And the Carthaginians have this insane legacy trait of having the buyout costs for everything, basically, the gold buyout costs. And that is incredible. It has incredible scaling potential as you progress through the eras if you're pursuing a buyout strategy. But Carthage doesn't have any way to generate money that is unique to the culture and can struggle to meet their primary era stars. They do have this emblematic quarter, the Kothon. It's a harbor that provides some industry for adjacent coastal water or lake, potentially up to +15. The fact that it's a harbor also helps you get some growth in your city from extra food. However, it is geography limited, so it's not going to be useful in areas where there isn't a coastline, obviously. Or if that coastline consists of a lot of deep water, you're going to be hard-pressed to make maximum use out of it. Meanwhile, the emblematic unit, the War Elephant, is extremely good. It has a bonus against units that are weaker than itself, which are most of them in the Classical, and it can roll over formations with ease. But it has the drawback that it is at a low priority technology. It's not particularly useful in offensive sieges, and it costs 2 copper to create, which can be difficult depending on how lucky you get with your spawn. So Carthage overall is playing into a gold buying strategy, and it can be really effective over the long game, but it has some downsides in the short term, particularly compared to some of the other cultures. So it's going to earn a B because of its long-term impact. The Mauryans are another culture that are really a militarist culture that are disguised as an aesthete in this case. And this has to do with their massively powerful emblematic unit, the Sumnahaya. which is a ranged elephant unit. It has a 30 combat strength, and several of these can take out large armies. That with their 3 range, they can siege down cities. They're extremely effective. It does suffer from unlocking at a dead-end technology that you might otherwise skip if you were another culture, and it has a fairly high production cost. To make proper use of the unit, you need to prepare to get it as soon as possible. However, the Mauryans do have a legacy trait which grants plus 10 faith and science on independent people under your patronage. So this is useful largely in the era in which you get it. It's not unrealistic to have 2 or 3 people under patronage advancing into the classical era, which is going to get you plus 20 to plus 30 faith or science. However, as the eras go up, the independent people largely disappear, so this trait is largely non-functional after the classical era. So you're using this to push your faith early and to tech up a little bit to help rush your elephants. The stupa, in the meantime, the emblematic quarter, is functionally a research quarter that provides a little extra faith and some increased influence from adjacency rather than science. I'd say it's a below average quarter, though you'll probably still build a few because the little bit of extra science and influence generation is still nice to have. The Mauryans are going to be looking to take over some enemy cities from the start, but because there's a prerequisite technology and high production costs, it takes longer to field the units than the Huns, and allows time for neighbors to build their own emblematic units, some of which act as soft counters to your own. So the Mauryans, B tier. Mayans are the next B tier, and the Mayans are builders that get plus 2 industry on a district producing industry. This isn't a super impactful bonus when you get it, but it still represents a nice boost to your industry. It can get a little bit better over time when you have more districts, but it's going to proportionally make up less of your industry as the game goes on. The reason to take the Mayans is the Kuna, the emblematic quarter. And this is effectively a maker's quarter that provides a little bit of faith and plus 3 industry for every territory you have in the city. While not usually realistic to have a ton of attached territories in classical due to the stability penalty, 4 is a pretty reasonable number, but where you'll get an extra plus 12 industry per quarter that you put down. So you'll have 4 of these, which can give you a maximum of 48 production just from the territories. And this is on top of any adjacency bonuses that you're getting, as well as any exploitations that you're getting. So overall, it's pretty good. Every time you put one of these down, it's kind of like building an extra 1 to 1.5 maker's quarters for free. The Noble Javelineers, the emblematic unit, on the other hand, are just an okay unit. The poison effect isn't super impactful because most units aren't interested in moving in the meat grinder, and the ones that want to take advantage of their movement can easily stay out of range. However, a CS-25 ranged unit in the classical era can still be useful on defense to support your front line, and can help plink away at people in offensive sieges. Overall, the production is good and can help build your cities up, but it isn't anything amazing, and there are plenty of situations where picking up another culture will serve you better, even though the Mayans are consistently a solid culture. Next are the Goths, who bring up the C tier. Changes to ransack have helped them considerably, with ransacking taking less time depending on your combat strength. Their legacy trait gives them plus 5 combat strength on a ransacking army, and their emblematic unit, the Gothic Cavalry, gets even more combat strength when they're ransacking. This makes the Gothic Cavalry really the Space Marines of the classical area when they're ransacking something. They're able to run around territory, ransack an outpost or unprotected administrative centers. They can plop down an outpost of their own and then run off to do it all over again. Because the Goths are militarist and care more about units than gaining territory, the ransacking doesn't really conflict with their affinity bonuses either. The Tumulus, it sucks. It provides plus 3 influence and plus 3 faith for minus 10 stability. It doesn't exploit anything, and it doesn't get any adjacency bonuses. You'll probably never build it. The Goths have a very specific strategy and are very good at executing it. The strategy isn't particularly good compared to most other strategies, but there are some situations in which you might be able to make effective use of it. And you better, because the Goths aren't going to do anything for you in later eras. Rounding out the C tier are the Romans. Perhaps poetically, the Romans land in the same tier as the Goths. The +1 unit slot legacy trait is really just a quality of life improvement that doesn't actually make a difference because of how reinforcements work and how battlefields are created. I talk more about that in my section on the Romans. Meanwhile, the Triumphal Arch is in competition for one of the worst districts in the game, providing a net of -3 influence and -7 stability, or +8 influence and +3 stability when your city is victorious after winning a war, and that lasts for 10 turns. It isn't really practical to be winning a war every 10 turns, and the influence output is much more consistent from quarters and traits of other cultures. The reason the Romans are in the C tier instead of D tier is the power of the Praetorians with their high combat strength and tactical superiority, which gives them even more combat strength when an ally is adjacent to the target they attack. They are the premier meat grinders of the classical. The problem is that they come at one of the last technologies in the era, so it takes a long time to get them out the door, and the window between you getting Praetorian guards and your opponent starting to get crossbows is small. So if you want to make effective use of Praetorians, you have to tool your entire game from the ancient era towards getting the Romans. With the Romans, that rounds out the tier lists. I hope you all enjoyed. I will be back next time with our medieval tier list, in which I will be talking about all the medieval cultures. We'll do the same thing as this video, where we have more in-depth discussion as well as a rounded summary at the end. I'll see you all next time.